Hi, I'm Jill Beitz, and I am the manager of reference and research at the Cincinnati History Library and Archives. If you don't know about us, we are located on the mezzanine at the Cincinnati Museum Center, and we are kind of your local one-stop shop for Cincinnati history and history of the Northwest Territory and surrounding areas. We started collecting items in 1831, and we have books, letters, maps, pamphlets, and the jewel of our collection is really our manuscript collection. We have tons of beautiful things that you can come in and research once we're open. Um, However, in the interim, since we're all kind of stuck at home, even though we aren't a lending library, I thought that I would share some of the things that I've been reading over the past 6 or 8 months. The majority of them are going to be history and biography tied to Cincinnati. However, there are a few that I've just included for other reasons because I found them interesting, or there's an author coming to town that you might want to see later on in the year. And I've also included a few historical fiction books that are from the Cincinnati or Kentucky area. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so you can have screenshots. I do want to say that all of these items are available for download at the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County, and probably any Northern Kentucky libraries. And they are also available on Audible if you're not in a position to get a hardback book at this time. Here we go. The first book that I want to share is The Pioneers. This is David McCullough's book about the settling of the Northwest Territory, beginning in the area that eventually became Marietta, Ohio. There are appearances by people you'll recognize from Cincinnati history, such as the Cutlers. You'll see Matt Anthony Wayne makes an appearance, and it's just a really fascinating view of what it was like to settle this area and be some of the first people after the Native Americans, or actually with the Native Americans. So one of the things I found most interesting about this book by McCullough, aside from the dependence on the river and how important the Ohio River is to the pioneers, is he discusses the forests and the density of the forests and the age of the trees and the hugeness of the trees. And it's just a beautiful visual, and it's hard to imagine. I mean, I feel like there are a fair number of forested areas around Ohio now, but nothing like it was then. There's also a chapter about the Burr conspiracy, in which Aaron Burr was attempting to possibly commit treason against the United States, even though he was acquitted. And you can read more about that. It's kind of fascinating and a way to tie into some other things. The next few books I want to talk about are both about George Remus, the infamous bootlegger. So Remus, everybody kind of knows about him, I think. He started out in Chicago. He was a pharmacist, then an attorney. Then he realized he could make a lot more money running bourbon. And so he built a huge empire that was based in Cincinnati. He built, or he bought actually, a mansion in Price Hill, which is sadly no longer there. And he would throw these immense parties where he would give away cars and diamond stick pins. And the rumor is that F. Scott Fitzgerald actually based Jay Gatsby on George Remus. Whether or not this is true, it's still a kind of a cool story. Both of these books came out in 2019. I suspect because currently we're at the 100th year of Prohibition taking effect, and so it was an excellent sort of timing for them to come out. Bob Batchelor's book, The Bourbon King, The Life and Crimes of George Remus, the Prohibition's Evil Genius, is actually, Bob's a local writer, and he digs very deeply into Remus's life, from his childhood through all of his businesses and building his empire, and then his eventual downfall. Karen Abbott's book, The Ghost of Eden Park, is more about the women in Remus's life. So he had 2 wives, a daughter and a stepdaughter, and there was also a woman that is not mentioned very often who was an assistant U.S. Attorney General, and she's the woman that sent Franklin Dodge to take George Remus down. So this is a little different perspective. And especially Imogene Remus, his second wife, who he ends up gunning down in Eden Park, is a very important character in this book. They're just a lot of fun. You can sip on some bourbon and read your books. The next book I'd like to talk about is called Sweet Taste of Liberty, A True Story of Slavery and Restitution in America. This book came out at the end of last year, and all of us who worked at the library had never heard this story, and it takes place in Cincinnati. So we all felt fairly clueless and started looking into it, and we do have some local newspaper stories about it. But the author, Caleb McDaniel, really dug deeply into it. Henrietta was a freed slave living in Cincinnati, and she was working for a woman. She was supposed to be being paid by this woman, but really she rarely got paid, if at all. However, one evening, this woman says they're going to go to Kentucky to visit some people. So it's not great to visit Kentucky when you're an African American and it's still the slave era. But she gets in the buggy and goes, and her employer has colluded with Zebulon Ward, who was a corrupt deputy sheriff, and he takes Henrietta and he sells her south into slavery. So Cincinnati, being on the Ohio River, was, right there on the edge of slavery. And there are some interesting Underground Railroad stories, some great stories that we hear around here a lot. And there are also some really terrible stories. There's the Margaret Garner story, which Toni Morrison's Beloved was based on, which is awful. And there's this story that seems awful. But after 17 years, finally, Henrietta has regained her freedom and made her way back to Cincinnati. And she decides that she is going to sue Zeb Ward for reparations. And after 8 years of this, she actually wins. It's not a lot of money, but it's enough to make a real difference in her son's life. The story is almost unbelievable, and I recommend reading it. And then when we're back open, come to the library and we'll show you some items we have about it. Aside from George Remus, probably anybody who's lived in Cincinnati is familiar with the Longworth family. Nick Longworth was one of the earliest businessmen in Cincinnati. He was the father of Catawba wine. His home is where the Taft Museum is now, and there's Longworth Hall, and you can't get away from the Longworths. So Mariah Longworth's store was from that family, and she founded Rookwood Pottery, which was pretty impressive in that era. And she also founded Mayfest, which is another thing that's still around. So you figure 140 years later, we have 2 things that this woman founded, and they still, are very successful. This book was written by C.J. Moore and Nancy Brewerman, and Nancy had pretty great access to Mariah's papers because she's the archivist at St. Ursula in Clifton. And the Storrs actually lived in an apartment there on the grounds in their later lives. The interesting thing about Mariah is she seems like a very progressive woman, and she knows a lot of movers and shakers. She's friends with Teddy Roosevelt. Her husband is an ambassador. They travel the world. But as for a progressive woman, Mariah is actually an intense anti-suffragist. And it's just such an interesting juxtaposition of how you'd assume that a woman like that would really focus on women's rights. But she was also a staunch Catholic, and the Pope didn't think that women should vote, and so Mariah didn't either. And she and a lot of other wealthy women in Cincinnati worked very hard to try to make this not happen. We're going to leave Cincinnati for a little bit and head west. Steve Inskeep is a reporter for National Public Radio. You're probably familiar with him. He's also an author. So he wrote this book about John and Jessie Fremont. John Fremont was an explorer, a soldier, a political activist, and his wife Jessie was the daughter of a U.S. senator. They were probably one of the first power couples in politics. She was his advisor. They worked together to bring attention to women's rights, abolition, and westward expansion. He was actually the first presidential candidate of the newly formed Republican Party. They would probably be all over CNN or MSNBC if they were around now. They were that famous and that well known throughout the country, even though it was a much earlier time. Our next book is called The Last Castle, and I bring this up for two reasons. Denise Kiernan was set to visit Cincinnati in May for the Women's City Club to talk about this book. And this is also going to be a book that we discuss at our first Friday book club on May 3rd at 10:30. This book club normally meets in the library, but we're going to have a Zoom book club meeting this month. So just watch the CMC webpage for more information. This book is about George and Edith Vanderbilt and their home, the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. It's really a view of their world spanning from the Gilded Age through world wars, through the Great Depression, and the people that their lives interact with. F. Scott Fitzgerald, Edith Wharton, Teddy Roosevelt, and also the entire Vanderbilt family and all of the other incredibly rich people that built this country during the early part of the 20th century. So I hope you'll join us for the book club meeting. Hope to see you there, virtually. And finally, as we leave the history and biography behind, Erik Larson, who is the author of Devil in the White City, has a new book about Winston Churchill. And it focuses on Churchill's response during the Blitz of London. He's a new prime minister. He's trying to, build up the British and work through this all during the Blitz and be powerful, but it also focuses on his family relationships at Chequers, which was his country estate. Erik Larson is amazing, and he will actually be visiting Cincinnati in early November in conjunction with the Mercantile Library. So keep your eye out for that. This one, I lied. This is the last one. This is a new biography about George Washington, and I'm including it because it is my favorite book that I've probably read in the last 6 months, but it's only been out a few months. It's written by Alexis Coe, who is a fairly young female historian, and the perspective is different than other biographies. We learn not just about George, but about his wife Martha and his mother Mary. It's also, we've always learned that Washington is the perfect soldier. And this book really shows how he was not. He was kind of a hot mess when he first began soldiering, and in fact made some really huge mistakes. We're just lucky that he figured it out when he needed to. Another interesting / kind of gross thing is she discusses his teeth, which of course weren't wooden because that would be bizarre, but the actual story about them is even worse than that and pretty disturbing. This also ties into a documentary called Washington that's streaming on the History Channel. So if you're at home looking for something to stream, it's pretty well done. And you can stream to it from Prime or if you have History on Demand. Now we're going to jump over to historical fiction. Sometimes you don't want to slog through a nonfiction book, you know, and you just want to kind of have a little escapism. So there are 3 books that I have that are focused on the Cincinnati and Kentucky areas. This first one is called The Eulogist, and it's about an immigrant family from Ireland who settles in Cincinnati in the early 19th century. It covers a cholera epidemic. It covers just day-to-day life during this time, and it eventually leads to a brother founding a soap business. And yes, Terry Gamble is a descendant of those Gambles, so it's kind of a fictionalized version of the Gamble family settlement in Cincinnati.
I was working and listening. How are you?
And finally, these 2 books are about the Packhorse Librarians of Kentucky. They came out just a few months apart last year. I'm not really sure why their timing was such, but the first book, The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek, actually introduced me to a part of the population I was unaware of called the Blue People of Kentucky. And this is a small segment of the population that had a blood disorder that caused them to appear blue. Because they looked different than other people, they were marginalized, and there were terrible things said and done to them. The main character in this is a blue person, and so this shows not only how she does her job as a Packhorse librarian, delivering books to throughout Appalachia during the Great Depression, but also how her physical appearance affects her life and interactions. This, in the 1960s, it was found out that this was actually a very easy thing to cure, and so it's no longer a problem, but it's interesting to read about. The second book, The Giver of Stars, is also about a Packhorse librarian in Kentucky. And these Packhorse librarians went out into Appalachia. They visited people who were alone with their children and whose husbands were working in the mines. I'm really sorry, Murphy. And I knew this was going to happen. And just a second, please. Done. So they helped to try to bring literacy to children and women, and also just a friendly face. So both of these books are great. Like I said, The Giver of Stars is a little more fluffy maybe, but I enjoyed them both. On that note, since Murphy says I'm finished, if you have any more questions or you'd like to learn more about the library, you can email us at library@cincymuseum.org. We'd love to hear from you, and we are answering our emails. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Not a question, but I am super, super excited about Erik Larson coming. I didn't know that was coming.
I'm sorry, what?
I said I didn't know about Erik Larson coming. I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, I think it's November 3rd. He's doing the big mercantile event, their fundraiser. I'm excited.
I love his stuff. I'm gonna have to put that on my calendar.
Yeah, that's great. I apologize for the dog. Thanks, everybody.
So Jill, I have a question.
Yes.
So you were saying that was one of the best books you read in the last several months. How many books do you read in a year?
I read a lot. I usually have 3 or 4 books going at a time, depending on my mood. So usually like some nonfiction, some heavier fiction, and then something really fluffy and silly. So
yeah. Cool. That's a lot of books.
It is. And I will say that this whole thing being home now, I'm reading a lot more because there's not a lot else to do. So I'm catching up.
Cool.
Jill, have you ever read If I Never Get Back by, I think, Daryl Brock?
Daryl Brock.
Mhm.
I have not, but actually it's funny. We've actually been thinking about doing that one for the book club.
That's a really good historical fiction one that I enjoyed a lot. I haven't read the sequel to it, though.
Yeah, I
Although
haven't
it's by
either.
Townsend.
Actually, just ran across that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
It's
and
a really
that's about
interesting story about the
it's
time
about
and
Shoeless
everything.
Joe, isn't it? Sort of.
No, it's about just baseball in general. So he goes
Okay.
back and joins the team in the 1865,
Oh, okay.
1869. Yeah, it's
Oh, that sounds great.
a really fun one. But it has a lot of landmarks, and there's this like interbedded story about how he influences modern day baseball with like inadvertently and purposefully,
Oh,
like all the different things he does for like adding to concessions and like how seating and stuff changes because of him. But it's really neat.
oh, wow. That sounds great. So I hope once we're back at work, we can load that one up, or even if we're not.
Another book that I'd recommend reading is Jefferson and the Giant Moose by Lee Dugotkin. It's a really great historical book on the development of natural history in the United States during Jefferson's presidency, and when he was governor of Virginia. And it also talks a little bit about sort of the history of science in this region as
Oh,
well.
that
So it
sounds
has
great.
a tie to Big Bone Lake, Kentucky and Cincinnati in there as well. And it's just a really fun, interesting read.
And a memorable title.
Yeah, Jefferson and the Giant Moose.
Okay. I'll have to check that one out too.
It's one of my favorites in the last little while.
Yeah, there are so many books out there. It's hard to keep up. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think, nice job, by the way. One of the most fun things we did for the library in-house book club meetings were pulling things from the collection related to the books. And our collection is so amazing. And there were newspaper articles and original documents and letters from the pioneers. Many of those people were featured prominently in our collection. Who knew? And it really gives you a connection to realize how important Cincinnati was to the settling of the.
Right, and it really, having the objects really just brings things to life. It really does.
So in that same vein, Jill and Mickey, we're about to partner with the Cincinnati Art Museum on a similar thing. So they have a book club where they review books a couple times a week. They do it by chapters, and they have been using objects from the Art Museum collections that have some sort of connection to the book. And so we are going to start getting involved in that fairly soon, using images of our collection objects and being involved in as discussants in the book. So I think it's kind of exciting to do that.
Definitely, and you can find that the link to that book club on the Art Museum's Facebook page. You just ask to join the CAM Connect group, CAM Connect, and the next book is going to be Around the World in 80 Days. And you can find that on Project Gutenberg for free, or you can download it from Audible for about $4. So,
cool.
A new and exciting adventure.
Oh, and right now we don't have access to most of our library collection, but if you go to the library website and go into the digital journals, you can find a great deal of information. You're looking at fairly recently written articles, but they do cite original primary source material and just contain a wealth of information about Cincinnati and archaeology and zoology and Native American objects in the collection.
Yep. And if you're on the website, take some time. There are a few collections on there about Native American resources that we have and others. So, and I believe next Thursday, Ann Kling will be doing a presentation at this time about the different online resources that the library has.